So if we look at the fourth shift, which is called text-based answers, we're really talking about evidence-based conversations about text amongst students and with teachers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is really about ensuring that students, when they are giving answers, either in class, in classroom discussion, or in writing, that they really are going back to the text for their evidence to support their argument. And I think that the challenge is how to make sure that they do that in a thoughtful, careful, precise way. Right? It's so easy to sort of, certainly I as a teacher know, that I sometimes accepted an answer that was tangentially related to the text, but not really from the text. You know, it was partly from general experience, from something I had said, from something a classmate had said, not really from the text. And so, you know, I think that discipline about asking students, you know, where in the text did you see that? Where did the author say that? Why do you think the author believes that? Show me the words. That's a really important discipline to have, both when you're sort of leading class discussion and giving feedback on student writing. And again, my own experience was I didn't do that as often as as I wish I had now, looking back as a teacher. And I think it's really a critical area of professional development. Even the most excellent teacher or the most effective teacher sometimes forgets that, right? Because you're in the flow of classroom discussion, and somebody says something you like, and you say, yes, exactly, and you move on without taking that moment to say, no, tell me what your evidence is for that, right? I think it's an important shift.
Well, and it's so easy to get excited if students are having rich conversations about the stuff the writer is writing about, right? So it can be very tempting if you see a student digging into the text and having a reaction, having their own epiphany, their own connection to the text based on their own experience, to not make room for that in the classroom.
Right.
So it actually requires some discipline and a little bit of letting go of watching the students make those connections in order to constantly pull the connections back to the text.
I think that's exactly right.
And I think that careful reading can be the basis for then making wonderful, deeper connections. But you need time for the text to live almost on its own. And it's funny because I think the movement away from the text is a lot, Kate, just like you're saying, to engage students, to interest them. Try to make it more interesting. It's interesting to talk about myself, what I feel, how I connect it to it, how it resembles my life. Often people describe it as the golden hook that gets kids interested in what they're reading. So I do think there's a challenge here at the heart of teaching, which is how do we develop a fascination with what the text is up to? How do we, through interesting questions, and these are not just like, is the car red? When we talk about text-based questions, it's of course also the inferences you make. What can you infer from what is said and unsaid? How does the argument fit together? I know you know all this, and so how do we create interesting sequences that cultivate kids' interest in doing this work, so we don't have to go outside the text for excitement?
One of the you've drawn our attention to the letter from Birmingham jail, David, and one of the sentences in the letter is, amongst many sentences we could choose, but one of the sentences is, "But I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension." And when I think about teaching this text, remembering teaching this text, I know that one of the easy temptations with a sentence like that is to ask students to think about what that word means in their lives, and what does it mean to provoke tension in a conversation? What does it mean to inject tension into something that could be easier or could be lighter? Rather than say, why is he saying it that way? And to your point, David, what is he up to?
Yes. And that's what the good reader does, right? They use the fact that they have been in a conversation that had tension in it to think about, well, what does the author mean by this specific use of the word tension in this context? And part of it is we've got to train students through our conversations about text to do that in their heads as readers, right? To not just make the sort of easy connection, but to make the deep connection that turns their experience into a question, a thought, and some level of analysis about what the author is trying to say.
Right.
C.S. Lewis wrote something wonderful where he says, when you're first encountering a work of art, surrender. He says, get yourself out of the way. And I think he doesn't mean we forget ourselves entirely, or that we don't have a self, but I think he felt that each text we read enlarges us when we give over to it and allow it to write on us and impress itself on us. And I think it's almost making space for it that we're looking for. And I think, I'm not sure text-based answers really gets at it, because I think sometimes you can say, oh, that conversation was based or prompted
Yeah.
by the text.
No, yeah.
Right,
And,
right.
and what we're
That's
really
true, that's
talking
true.
about is a level of careful attention to the
Yes.
text and the
Yes.
evidence from it that's deeper than just
Yes.
saying it was based on or related to, like the movie based on the book.
Right. Well, because one moment where a student doesn't hold that conversation in their own heads and speaks it, and then the teacher indulges it and allows it to move 3 students later, you're no longer you're no
That's
longer
exactly
talking
right.
about the
That's
text.
That's exactly
right.
right. That's
That's right.
exactly
You've
right.
now
That's
completely
right.
departed
It's like a
from
chain
the
reaction.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. And so again, it's that it goes to this issue of how do you plan for a lesson, how do you plan for a
Yes.
unit, how do you ensure that you anticipate that and then turn the students back to the text, right? So you know the students are going to make this connection with tension, but then how do you say to that student, but what's the tension that Martin Luther King is talking about in this paragraph?
Yeah.
You know, where does he first introduce the word
Yeah.
tension, and then where does he go with that?
Right.
You know, and that, I think, that requires very, very careful planning.
Speaking of which, David, I know that your team has been working for a while on a unit, an exemplary unit on Gettysburg Address, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you have spent weeks trying to decide which
That's
questions
exactly
to
right.
ask in order
That's
to
exactly
provoke
right.
that conversation, right?
It is not simple work, because you're trying to define questions that not only are text dependent, but worth asking,
Yeah.
worth exploring, that deliver richly, that as you look at the text more closely, you see more and more in it, because that's the true source of excitement and interest. And I would say, to be clear, that once you've deeply taken in what exactly King meant and didn't mean by tension, and you've immersed yourself in that, then it might be very interesting after such a
Yes,
close encounter
yes,
to then
exactly.
say, how does that resemble and not resemble what I've experienced or seen in others? But it's more a matter of priority
Right.
and giving more time for the text to breathe and be the first source of investigation than eliminating any kind of further connection or.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned in grad school was that in order to help students to access the text and have a meaningful conversation about it, you have to activate schema, right? Like you have to wake up. I used to
Yeah.
say I used to tell students that we were tilling the soil. We were mucking up the soil so that we could throw seeds at it. And the essential way to do that prior to a text is to ask them to think about the content, ask them to
Yeah.
think about the language,
Yeah.
pull pieces of it out and do this pre-reading activity where they are starting to make meaning of the stuff before they even access the text. I would love to hear both of you react to that idea in this new context.
Let
What
me-
happens to that activity in this
Let me
context?
ask you as an artist rather than a teacher. Imagine you spent weeks, even months, maybe years, developing the opening chapter of your book, and you thought carefully about exactly how you wanted to introduce it, and exactly what associations you wanted to build, and how to unfurl it. And then someone thought the best way to teach it was to interrupt your way of beginning and add all their own associations and entirely distort the ability for you to set the table. What would you feel as an author? One thing that was amazing in drafting the core standards was the warm response we got from writers and artists who said, thank goodness that you're emphasizing a kind of reading that celebrates our work as setting the context, because writers, every writer, does the work you're describing. They are prompting things, they're reminding you of things, they're setting the table, they're choosing just what to leave in and leave out.
So am I as a teacher getting in the way of that?
In a sense, what I'm trying
Yeah.
to say is, and then it can be true when you start this way that it's very disorienting. And often if a good writer disorients you, they might have meant to.
Yeah.
But it may be that it takes then some work to say, okay, wait, we're all confused.
Right.
Let's pause, let's slow down, to allow that confusion. But I think it's worth the confusion to give the author the chance to begin, more times than not.
Yeah. What do you think, John?
I think in some ways, there's just, we talk in terms of the pre-reading, the during reading, the post-reading, but in many ways there's just reading, right? That's what you do when,
Yeah, exactly.
as you read the text, right? You encounter a reference to another text, an unfamiliar event, and then you've got to dig in even more deeply to the text and try and figure out what's going on, what's the information there. And so there may be pieces of information, I think, that a teacher has to bring into the text as you're reading. But again, that goes to careful planning.
Yes.
You have to have read the piece. You don't have quite enough time to plan it out all the way.
Right.
And you get into the piece and you find that you confront, an allusion to some other event.
Right.
And you have to have now ready information to support the student in that moment, because what matters is the author's making that reference to that other event right there in that paragraph for a reason. Right? And so you want to have that information there to support your students at that moment. That goes, again, to this idea of very, very careful planning.
There is a real shift here. you're spending much more time in preparing for instruction by reading carefully yourself. And that, in fact, becomes the main work of preparing.
Because one of the things we're trying to create an opportunity for is for students to make their own judgments, right? It's for the students to become scholars,
Right.
Yes.
as
yes.
opposed to just witnesses of a text and moving on to the next one.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And that again, I just think goes to this issue of close reading, that the scholar's reading of a text is a close reading of the text and really engaging with the author and what the author is trying to say.
In order to have a conversation about
That's
that
right.
text.
That's right.
That's
right.
I think what you just said, a really good text-based question, I sometimes say text-dependent question, is a good question about that text that may not be a great question about every text.
Yeah.
One thing that happens is kids get very used to the generic questions, like,
Yes, that's
like
so true.
what does the Great Gatsby have to do with the American dream? You know, as soon as you've done that cliche, it's over, right? Because who cares about Gatsby? We know there's an American dream, and sometimes it gets disappointed, and it's over.
Right.
So I think part of what we're looking for is questions that are really specific.
Yeah.
Like not what's the main idea, theme, but what's happening in this paragraph, what's happening here, how does this argument build? There's a this, a
Right.
focus on this thing.
Why did
like
he
you
choose
said.
those three things in the sentence instead
Exactly.
of two?